This Film is Lit, the podcast where we finally settle the score on one simple question. Is the book really better than the movie? I'm Brian, and I have a film degree, so I watch the movie, but don't read the book.
And I'm Katie. I have an English degree, so I do things the right way and read the book before we watch the movie.
So prepare to be wowed by our expertise and charm as we dissect all of your favorite film adaptations and decide if the silver screen or the written word did it better. So turn it up, settle in, and get ready for spoilers, because this film is lit. I am putting myself to the fullest possible use, which is all I think that any conscious entity can ever hope to do. It's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and this film is lit. Well, welcome back to This Film is Lit, the podcast where we talk about movies that are based on books. It is, I don't know how it took us 140 episodes to get to this one, but we are finally talking about 2001: A Space Odyssey, a classic of science fiction film, and based on a short story by Arthur C. Clarke, which we're going to talk about. We don't have a Guess Who this week, which is pretty common for short story related stuff, but we do have every other segment. So we're going to get right into it. If you have not read or watched 2001: A Space Odyssey recently, we're going to give you a little brief summary of both the short story and the film in Let Me Sum Up.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke. In the imagined future of 1996, a group of scientists is mapping the surface of the moon. One day, one of them spies something glittering on a distant hilltop. He and another scientist decide to go have a look. They reach the base of the outcrop and scale it. Once at the top, they see that the top is completely flat, and in its center is a small, glittering metallic pyramid. The narrator's initial thought is that they've discovered evidence of a previous lunar civilization, but then quickly thinks otherwise. He realizes that although the surrounding area is covered in thick moon dust, there is a perfect circle around the pyramid that is completely clean. He tosses a small rock, which bounces off of an invisible force field. The story then jumps forward in time, and we learn that it took years for humankind to break through the force field to investigate the pyramid, and once they did, they couldn't determine what the purpose of it was. The narrator surmises that the pyramid was likely a sentinel placed on the moon by a more advanced species to signal to them that humanity had progressed enough to be capable of space travel.
Here's the summary for 2001: A Space Odyssey, the film. We open on a group of early hominins in Africa. One tribe is chased away from a watering hole by a rival tribe. The next day, the tribe that lost that battle discovers a large black rectangular monolith. After interacting with the monolith, one of the hominins discovers the concept of tools and weapons after picking up an animal bone. This hominin's tribe then uses these weapons to defeat the other tribe and reclaim the watering hole. Cut to millions of years in the future, we're introduced to Dr. Haywood Floyd, who is traveling to Clavius base on the moon. On his way there, he encounters some Russians, and he discusses rumors about the base with these Russian scientists who mention that no one has heard from Clavius in over a week, and there's speculation and rumors that there has been some epidemic, and that is what is causing this radio silence. When Haywood arrives at the base, it is revealed that the reason for the radio silence is in fact that the base has discovered a black monolith in Tycho crater that is nearly identical to the monolith from the opening in Africa. Upon inspecting the monolith, it emits a high-powered radio signal that overwhelms the scientists studying it. 18 months later, we join up with the American spacecraft Discovery 1, which is on its way to Jupiter, with pilots Dr. Dave Bowman and Dr. Frank Poole, as well as 3 other scientists in suspended animation. The 6th member of the crew is Hal, who is a HAL 9000 supercomputer with a human personality that controls most of the operations and technology on the ship. Hal reports a problem with an antenna control device, claiming that the piece of equipment will soon fail. Dave removes the device and tests it, but they are unable to find any issues. Hal insists that the part is faulty and that the only explanation for this incongruence is human error, while mission control back on Earth, their backup computer is telling them that Hal has made a mistake. Frank and Dave become concerned about Hal's behavior And while sitting in an EVA pod to avoid Hal hearing them, they discuss shutting Hal down if necessary. But Hal is able to follow this conversation by reading their lips through the pod's window. When Frank then goes out to replace the antenna unit, Hal takes control of his EVA pod and sends Frank adrift, resulting in his death. Dave then ventures out to rescue Frank / retrieve his body. And while he's outside, Hal shuts off the life support on the 3 crew members in stasis, killing them. Then Dave returns to the ship with Frank's body, and Hal refuses to let him in, forcing Dave to abandon Frank's body and then use the emergency escape hatch on the pod to traverse the vacuum of space without a helmet, and then he makes it safely back into the ship's airlock. Dave then heads to Hal's processor core, disconnects Hal as Hal begs him not to, and slowly and creepily shuts down. Upon Hal shutting down, the ship plays a recording from Dr. Haywood explaining that the true purpose of the mission was to investigate the radio signal that was sent from the monolith on the moon to Jupiter. Arriving at Jupiter, Dave discovers a gigantic third monolith orbiting the planet. Upon inspecting this monolith in his EVA pod, Dave travels through a stargate, observing a vortex of colored light and bizarre cosmological phenomena before arriving in a large neoclassical bedroom where he sees and becomes older versions of himself. After several age progressions, a very old and seemingly dying Dave lies in bed. A monolith appears in the room at the end of his bed. Dave reaches for it and then is then transformed into a space fetus floating around Earth. The end. That was mostly copied with some slight additions and tweaks by myself from Wikipedia's summary of the story for this film. We also wanted to talk about, I just wanted to mention again, we talked about it in the prequel, but if you don't listen to the prequel, there is a novelization of this film that was written in concert with the film by Arthur C. Clarke that some people may ask, why aren't we doing that one? We generally don't do novelizations, usually because they're a little bit different. This one's right on that line where it's different enough than the film. Or sorry, they're usually too similar, I guess is what I should say, the novelization and the film. In this one, it was written along the same time as the film, but it's basically based on the film. Kind of reverses the order of how we generally like to explore these things, the way we do our podcast, going from book to film. So this one is kind of like that weird middle land where it was written simultaneously. It is different enough from the film that you may be able to make an argument, but we wanted to go to the source material that initially Kubrick was pulling from, him and Clarke, when they wrote this screenplay, which was The Sentinel, along with a couple other short stories, but primarily The Sentinel was the main short story that he chose, and then they expanded upon, and we're just going to see what roots are there. Again, just because a lot of basically every question I answered for the novelization, the answer would be yes for the most part, because it is just a novelization of the film with some additional stuff and additional context and information and stuff like that. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's in that novelization, but again, that's why we didn't do that, but we are doing the short story. Hopefully that answers anybody's question in case they're like, why didn't you do the novelization? But yes, that's what's going on there. So that all being said, I have quite a few questions. We're going to get into those in Was That in the Book?
Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone.
The what?
Honestly, don't you two read?
So I am expecting a lot of the answers for these questions to be no, which is usually the case when we do a short story. And in particular, this one, we talked a little bit at length. We talked a little bit ahead of time about what, we knew in the prequel that there was other stories they were pulling from and other stuff. So I'm not going to be surprised if the answer to many of these questions is no. But I still wanted to ask about a lot of the big sort of, iconic imagery, lines, that sort of stuff from the film. Obviously not every single one, but a lot of them, and see if any of that came from the short story. So the film opens up on the Dawn of Man sequence, which I described in the summary, which is the hominins in Africa, their whole thing, discovering the monolith, learning to use weapons, match cut to space station. So, or satellite, not a space station. So I wanted to know if anything from that sequence came from The Sentinel, the story. It's kind of a two-part question. Mainly, one, anything with the sort of Dawn of Man sequence, and then two, subsection B, the monolith. I assume the monolith does, because I assume that's why it's called the Sentinel. I imagine maybe the Sentinel is the monolith. Maybe not. I don't know. But I want to know. Yes, those are the two questions here. Dawn of Man sequence, and then subsequently tied into that, the monolith. Did those come from the Sentinel?
Okay, so the Dawn of Man sequence is not from the Sentinel. It's supposedly inspired by another of Clark's short stories called Encounter at Dawn.
Okay.
I skimmed that story. I found like a PDF of it, and
Yeah.
I skimmed through it. It was only like 9 pages long. And it is about a manned space mission finding a planet that's similar to Earth in early civilization. And they do interact with a group of people native to the planet, but the story isn't very similar to the movie sequence at all. The beings in the story are far more advanced. They're like an early society.
Yes.
They have a village with a wall. One of them is hunting with a spear when they find
They're
him.
much more like they're like human.
Yeah,
as
yeah.
opposed to
The,
more
the,
like
the
ape-like
movie's
ancestors.
depiction obviously takes place like far before
Yes.
that period of evolution.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And, you're correct that the mysterious alien technology, which, as I mentioned, is a pyramid in the short story, is the titular Sentinel. But as far as we know, in the short story, there is not one on Earth. They just find the one that's on the moon.
Okay.
I did think that the Dawn of Man sequence was interesting and creepy.
Yeah.
If maybe not evolutionarily accurate.
Yes, I obviously it probably wasn't quite so much of an accurate depiction of that, but I do think it is an interesting. I like the sequence a lot, and I do think I was impressed by the how well we talked about in the prequel that it was mimes and stuff doing the ape or the hominins, the early ape ancestors, whatever these they're not monkeys, they're whatever, they're early ape ancestors. I was really impressed by the way they were able to make them feel generally like animals and not like people in suits for the most part, which I thought was pretty impressive. And another thing that I thought was interesting about that segment from your notes here about the monolith specifically, I did mention in the prequel episode that at one point the early version of the monolith was a pyramid, probably based from the story.
Yeah, probably a little more closer to what's in the story.
And then it was I believe clear, and then eventually they made it this rectangular monolith shape, and then they also decided that the clear didn't look good on camera, especially with lights and stuff and reflections, and so they just painted it black and thought that worked. So the original version of it was much closer to the story's version.
Yeah, it's interesting the decision to change that. The rectangular monolith is definitely very like foreboding.
Yes.
I also think a pyramid maybe arguably comes with too much like cultural baggage for Earth.
Yeah. No, you definitely, I mean, you already have a million conspiracy theories about Kubrick movies, and I think putting a pyramid in there would have just added even more. Yeah, there is a lot of iconographic baggage to a pyramid that there isn't necessarily to
a big black box.
A big black rectangle, yeah. So then we jump forward from the Dawn of Man sequence, and we're introduced to Dr. Haywood, and he gets to the space station on his way to the moon. And on the space station, he's talking to these other Russian scientists, and they're talking about this Clavius base and about how there hasn't been any communication from them. And I believe they say like 10 days or something like that. And when people call them, they just get like a pre-recorded thing and nobody knows what's going on. And there's speculation that it's an epidemic. And I wanted to know if any of that came from the short story, because I thought that was actually really interesting sort of tension building, and I liked the mysterious setup. I thought it was a fun setup of like what's going on. We haven't heard from the space, and we don't even necessarily know that the doctor's going there right away. Like I don't think initially.
He does say like when he gives his name and stuff to get into the space station.
That's right.
He says his destination is the moon.
Yes. So but that doesn't. There's lots of bases on the moon, I think, or several at least at this point. So we don't know for sure he's going to this one. But we will find out he's going to the space. But I do like setting up that mystery, and I wanted to know if that came from the book, because I just thought it was very funny they set that up, and I also like his reaction to it in the movie. He's just like, they're like, it's been 10 days since we heard from them, and Dr. Haywood was just like, no, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure, they're probably just like hungover or whatever. Like he's just like, it's fine. And again, I like setting that mystery up and like, well, what's clearly he's hiding something.
Yeah.
And I went, does any of that come from the book?
No, none of that comes from the
Okay.
book. The short story takes place entirely on the moon, and it's about the initial discovery of the Sentinel, which the movie skips over.
Yeah, we're seeing it after they've discovered
Yeah.
it and kind of how they're dealing with like,
Yeah.
the situation now that they've found it.
Yeah, but I agree with you. It is kind of a fun tension building and way to show that, like, obviously he does know what's going on, but he does not want to discuss it with these other scientists.
Yeah. And then kind of tied into that, I liked how slowly it built up to revealing what it was on the moon and then finally seeing the monolith. I really liked how it took a while, and then especially coming off of the opening, the Dawn of Man sequence, and we're just building these layers of questions because it's like, oh, okay, well, what's going on this moon base? And then he gets there, and it's like a good 30 minutes before we even get to the moon, and then we get to the moon, and we see the monolith, and we're like, what the heck? That's the same thing from the prehistoric times in the opening sequence, and I want to know if the story built up the revelation of what they found in a similar way, like with that same kind of like building mystery. It's similar to my last question, I guess.
There's not as much build up in the shorts. It's like a 10-page short story compared to lots and lots of build up in this movie.
Yeah.
There is a little bit of a build in the short story, I would say, where we're like with these lunar explorers as they're going to find whatever it is that they saw glittering in the distance. Most of the story is like about them traveling to it before they get there. So you could argue that that's a kind of a build.
Yeah, and especially so it does set up they see something in the distance and don't know what it is. So there's a little bit of that at least of like, what is it? What are kind of like the mystery of trying to figure out what we're going to go see is definitely different, and it's one of my favorite. So I think when the movie is most effective to some extent was that initial build up to that sequence. We'll get to more stuff, but so once we finally get to the monolith and they get down into Tycho crater where this monolith was discovered, they're kind of like examining it, looking at it, and they're taking pictures of it, and they take a picture of it with it like all standing in front of it, and when they do that, it emits this very high-pitched sound that we can hear as the audience, but also they can clearly hear because they all start like, kind of like freaking out. And we will find out later that it is a high-energy radio signal that was being sent to Jupiter. Again, we find this out at the end of the movie, basically, when the little recording plays, I think, with Dr. Haywood. And I wanted to know if the monolith emitting this weird, or the Sentinel in the book story's case, emitting this weird high-pitched droning noise came from the book, because I was not prepared for it, and neither were our cats.
No, they hated it. So in the book, the pyramid doesn't give off a signal that anyone notices.
Okay.
So they aren't able to figure out exactly what it does in the book. That they assume that its purpose is to signal to whatever society left it that humanity has advanced enough to be able to find that thing on the moon.
Okay. And we'll talk about it more later, but that's also the purpose in the movie. Whether or not that's revealed necessarily. I mean,
it's implied.
It's implied. And it's very explicitly discussed in the book, apparently. And I have some more notes on this later that we'll talk about. Again, that I thought was kind of interesting in the novelization's expansion on it. But it is basically the same idea that they went for. That is this like signal device to be like, look, humans got to the moon.
Yeah.
They're advanced enough for whatever it is that the aliens wanted to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, our cats did not enjoy this film.
No, it's a lot of silence and then random like obnoxious
random
noises.
Shrill beeping and squealing.
And the cats were just like, no thank you. Do not like this. Just as they would get relaxed, a different weird sound would happen. Yeah. Then we jump to our next plot. We jump forward in the film after the sound thing. It just hard cuts and we jump forward. It says 18 months later, and we are now joining in media res a space mission to Jupiter. Spacecraft Discovery 1 is on its way to Jupiter. We don't really know why, and neither does the crew, as it turns out. Yet they will find that, or Dave will find that out later. But I wanted to know if any of this came from the story, and it sounds like not. This feels like a separate story to me because, again, with what I knew of how short the Sentinel story was, I assumed it was basically the moon story part. But I wanted to know if any of this came from the book.
So you are correct in your assessment. This sequence is not from the Sentinel or from Encounter at Dawn. I did go ahead and skim a third short story that I saw in one place cited as some inspiration for this movie. That story is called Rescue Party. Full disclosure, I did not skim this one as closely as Encounter at Dawn, partly because the PDF of it that I found had like weird PDF mess ups in the text, you know, where the like weird line breaks and words smashed together and stuff. So it was kind of hard to read. But it didn't seem super similar to this, other than that it's about a manned discovery mission through space. They do pass by Jupiter at the beginning of that short story, but it is not their destination.
Okay. And we did talk about in the prequel that initially their destination wasn't going to be Jupiter in the film. It was going to be Saturn, but they didn't like the way the rings looked when they were doing the special effects, so they just changed it to Jupiter, apparently. But yeah. Okay. Yeah, that is kind of what I assumed. So then we're probably going to get into a lot of things here at this point, now that we're past the opening moon sort of story. We're going to get into a lot of stuff that is not in the book, but we're going to talk about it anyways. Speaking of the next thing, the spaceship, and I have a feeling a lot of this stuff is going to come from Kubrick's own mind, and specifically all of the scientists and like science. What is the word? I can't. There's a word for like futurists and stuff that he worked with, kind of designing and coming up with the designs of the spaceship and the interiors and everything for this film. But I wanted to know if the rotating spaceship that simulates Earth gravity, which is what at least a section of the Discovery one that we see, and it's the main section they're in. It's this rotating ring that spins to create centripetal force so that it basically like recreates gravity. I wanted to know if that was described at all in the stories that you read.
I did not find any mention of that in any of the material that I looked at.
Okay.
So I think you're probably right that that was from Kubrick.
Yeah, I think Kubrick, and again, he consulted with quite a few. I talked a little bit about in the prequel, at least artist-wise, he consulted with some people that were like very into like sci-fi art and were like big in the sci-fi art world. And specifically one guy, I can't remember his name, who a lot of his work inspired a lot of NASA stuff and the American space program and stuff like that. And I'm sure he was talking to other scientists and all kinds of stuff. And Clark himself, I'm sure, was a big resource for this in terms of like dreaming up the tech and the science fiction-y stuff that we see. Because a lot of it actually, does. We'll talk about some of the other elements of it, but a lot of the tech itself is very grounded in a realistic way. Whether how achievable it is its own thing, but it's at least fairly believable in terms of like
it looks
grounded
believable. I buy it.
Yeah, you buy it, and again, a lot of it is grounded in like actual physics and stuff like that. Although from everything I've heard, the rotating spaceship to simulate gravity is way more complicated and probably not anything we'll ever do for complicated reasons that I don't understand. I remember there's some podcast they were talking about it recently, and they were figuring out about like there was some reason that it was like, we probably won't ever do that. It's probably not like it's kind of doable, but it's there was some issue with it and I just don't remember what it was that made them think that we probably really won't ever do that. Maybe it had to do with how big it needed to be or something. I think it was something like in order to like do that and spin it either needs to be too big or spin too fast or something like that. That basically made it like we probably just won't do that because it's not worth it. I thought. I could be wrong though. So, big question. Obviously, one of the main and most memorable things about this film is HAL 9000, the artificial intelligence, the computer with a personality a personality interface or whatever they say that controls the Discovery 1 spaceship and that they talk to. I want to know if there's a HAL 9000 or a robot like that, and I wanted to know if it has a little red light interface that they talk to, because that little red light is very important to the sort of whole vibe of HAL.
So HAL is not from anything that I read, although he was by far my favorite part of the movie. This was also the only part of the movie where I felt like I was watching a movie instead of a fever dream.
It is probably my favorite part of the movie, mostly.
Now, I will say the spaceship in Rescue Party is called S9000. So
Okay.
maybe
So
the
that could be
name could have been, they might have been pulling from that. I did have this in better in the movie. HAL 9000, I think, is very like classically sci-fi.
yeah.
Great character, great villain. And then the conversation about whether or not he has feelings, I thought really hit different amid all the discussion of AI that we've been having this year.
Oh yeah, no, it definitely is one of those things that again, with the rapid onset of the AI revolution and stuff that we've kind of been going through over the last year or two, is definitely feels very timely. And there are just, especially in that interview at the beginning of the film where they're watching like the news interview where they're talking
Yeah.
to that guy and he's talking about like, oh, it seems like it has a personality, do you think it does? And they're kind of like talking about like, do you, basically asking like, do you think that Hal is like sentient or whatever, or has emotions and feelings and stuff like that, or is it just like a robot, is it just a computer? But yeah, I thought that all was very interesting. So I just did a little bit of quick searching to see if I could find anything about like the inspiration for Hal or anything like that. And on the Wikipedia article, there's a whole Wikipedia article for Hal, and there's nothing specific cited. It sounds like initially they had planned for it to be more of a robot, and it was initially named Socrates. And then I mentioned in the prequel at one point it was named Athena. When it had a woman's voice, basically, before they landed on HAL 9000. But apparently, in earliest draft, it's like a humanoid robot. And
There is a humanoid robot in Encounter at Dawn.
maybe that's, yeah.
So,
And it says it's introduced as overseeing Project Morpheus. I don't know what that is. Which studied prolonged hibernation in preparation for long-term space. Anyway, so it sounds like it's it was from an earlier draft of the script doing something else, kind of, and then it just slowly morphed into the robot that was like the spaceship's, central nervous system, basically. And yes, the name it said came from just literally like just what it stands for, because
right.
It says Hal's name, according to Arthur C. Clarke, is derived from heuristically programmed algorithmic computer. So Hal, heuristically algorithmic. So that really there wasn't, and apparently after the film they noticed that Hal is just one letter shifted off from IBM, and people speculated that was kind of like a fun little jab at the movie. But Clark and Kubrick both said that is not the case, saying, quote, about once a week some character spots the fact that Hal is one letter ahead of IBM and promptly assumes that Stanley and I were taking a crack at the established institution. As it happened, IBM had given us a good deal of help, so we were quite embarrassed by this and would have changed the name had we spotted the coincidence. So that is apparently not the case, at least according to them. They could be lying, who knows. But yes, Hal, obviously, like I said, one of kind of is also like my favorite part of the film, and it's the thing everybody remembers the most, that and probably the monolith with being like the two big things, and like the Dawn of Man sequence at the beginning. But yeah, it's a great character. So once Hal starts malfunctioning, they think he's having issues. They're getting suspicious of Hal, so they want to have a secret conversation. So they go into this EVA pod and they shut it, and then they sit there and they have a conversation. But then Hal is able to spy on them through the little window of the pod and read their lips. And I wanted to know if any of that sequence and any of that came from anything that you saw.
Did not come from anything that I read, but I also loved this scene. I really loved the ominous framing from inside of the pod with Hal's red light just in the window.
Just between them in the background, just sitting there. You can just see him and you're like, oh, crap. And it takes a long time before we get the shot where you see he's reading their lips, but you just know.
He's there the whole time and you're like, nah, that fucker knows.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite little details in that scene is actually right before it. They're talking to Hal about like, they're discussing like the issue and like, oh, why do you think that, this part doesn't seem bad? And they're saying it's not bad. And Hal's like, well, I don't know. The only explanation I have is human error. And they're like, oh, okay. And then at the end of the conversation, I love Dave, I think, turns to Frank and is like, I got a little issue with my EVA pod. Why don't we go take a look at that? And the way he says, see you later, Hal, is like, I don't know, the delivery on that was very funny to me. I love I love the way that they like kind of like surreptitiously like
It was, yeah, it was very unsuspicious for
Yeah.
sure.
yeah. I wanted to know if this line specifically that you found anywhere, it's probably the most famous line from this movie, maybe? It's one, maybe at least the one that gets quoted the most. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. I wanted to know if that is from the the book in any way, because good lord, the sass is off the charts with this robot. You cannot help but like read so much emotion into such a monotone, like
Yeah.
sort of generic line delivery. It's so good.
So again, it's not from anything that I read. I did have this in Better in the Movie. I really liked Hal's heel turn into a villain. Pretty iconic,
Yes.
I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is one of the most iconic lines in cinema for a reason, because yeah, it's a great little development of character, and again, there's just so much emotion and layers to such an emotionless performance, which I think is interesting. At any point in any of the stories that you read, does anybody launch themselves through the vacuum of space into an airlock from like one spaceship to another? Because I thought this was really interesting. And I mentioned, I didn't mention this coming in, but I mentioned the prequel and stuff. This is the first time I've seen this since I've been able to form memories, I think. I think I saw this when I was like a young kid with my dad probably, and thought it was boring, didn't understand it, remembered some of the elements of it, but just in general didn't stick with me very well. But it was interesting watching it now and seeing so many different things that so many other movies and stuff that I've seen very clearly were inspired by or pulled stuff from. And there was a little scene, and I believe it's in Sunshine, which is a great sci-fi movie if you have not seen it. It's a Danny Boyle directed film. It's got Chris Evans in it, a bunch of other people. But they're on a space mission to the sun. And at one point, they have to go from one spaceship to the other. And I believe they do this. I think it's in Sunshine. They do the same thing where they basically blow open an airlock and like launches them from one spaceship to the other. And they know if you can survive the vacuum of space for a little bit of time. And in the movie, they talk about like we had figured out more specifically like how to do it. And it was like holding your breath and like basically creating like a negative pressure in your head or whatever. Kind of like the thing you do to like equalize pressure, like when you're in a plane or something like that, can help. But anyways, I want to know if that sequence is in the book, because I thought that was really interesting.
It was not in anything that I read.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, I'm not even as well versed in sci-fi as you are,
and I'm not even particularly well versed.
But even I can see where this film had influence on further sci-fi films.
Yeah, no, definitely there. And this is just one little scene of it, and again, it really just stuck out to me because I love Sunshine so much. But yeah, I thought that was interesting and I think I remember reading when I was doing research for the prequel that they wanted to include that scene, but they weren't sure if it was realistic or not. And then I think they like ended up talking to somebody from NASA or something, and it was like cutting edge, quote unquote, research that they had just kind of figured out that people probably could, for a very brief time, like you could be exposed to space and not just like immediately die. Like you won't die in like a second or two. In fact, I think it's like up to like, it's a longer time than you would think that you can be in like the vacuum of space before you will like die or suffer really severe consequences. Obviously, you start suffering pretty bad stuff pretty quickly, but a matter of 10 seconds or whatever, again, you can kind of minimize the amount of harm you will suffer, and it's totally survivable. So it's actually a pretty realistic scene, all things considered, which I thought was interesting. We talked about there is no robot or whatever, so obviously this next question, but I wanted to know if this maybe is a reference to anything that you were aware of, and this is the scene where Dave goes after he gets back into the ship and he needs to shut down Hal. So he goes into the server processor room and starts pulling all the chips out or whatever and shutting Hal down. And as he's doing this, Hal's like talking to him and begging him not to do it and like saying it's afraid and stuff. And then at the end, when he's finally about to shut down, it starts singing Daisy Bell, which is another moment that everybody remembers in this film, is the robot slowly dying and singing an ever lower pitch shifted Daisy Bell. And I wanted to know if any of that came from any of the stories or anything that you could think of.
It's not a reference to anything that I know of. I liked this scene. I thought it was really creepy. I really like that Hal's voice doesn't have like emotion inflected into
Yes.
it still
Yeah.
during this scene. Like obviously his voice changes like as he gets closer and closer to
Right.
like being shut down,
But-
and like his voice like slows down
Yes.
and the pitch deepens,
But the
like you said.
inflection and stuff
Yeah,
is
but
not,
they made the choice that I think was a very good choice
Yeah.
to not inflect any kind of like human emotion into it as
No.
he's begging for his life,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting as well too. It's a great scene. So many good scenes in a movie that I don't care about mostly. Annoy some people there.
Yeah.
But we'll get into that. We have a
yeah.
lot of discussion about that coming up here in literally just a second. I enjoyed watching this movie, and I think I may never watch it again.
I did also like the creepy little song I wanted to mention.
Yeah.
It felt like a little moment of like horror movie.
Yeah.
In
And
this
movie
this broad sci-fi epic.
This movie has a lot of kind of it is very much, which Kubrick is just, it's one of the things he's very good at, is tension and dread and
Yeah.
suspense. And so this movie leans into that a lot. I always as a kid found the opening sequence with, I remember seeing that, as a kid, and I found that opening sequence with the apes and stuff really creepy and weird. Obviously the apes themselves are kind of creepy looking, and because they're they're it's that like almost an uncanny valley thing of like they look like animals and move like animals, but you can tell they're not actually animals, which is kind of creepy. And then the biggest thing for me that I always thought was super creepy is once the monolith shows up in the beginning, the music.
Oh, yeah, I have a note about the music.
Yeah, we
later.
had a note about that,
Just,
but I was just the music is like this building of like wailing, and it's just very creepy and off-putting. And so I think throughout and there's a handful of scenes like that throughout the movie where I think this is kind of a slow burn horror film. I mean, it's very much because it is like the whole thing is kind of like just builds this existential dread under the surface of the whole thing, which is kind of the point for sure, definitely. But I think that does at times teeter it into almost being like a horror film without there ever being like a jump scare or like a any like traditional horror film stuff, which is really interesting. And then my last question is, does one of our intrepid explorers, or in the Sentinel or maybe anything else, in the film Dave ends up at the end going through this Stargate, is what it's called in all media referencing this. It's never said or called that in the film from my knowledge, because it's from the moment he goes in there, I don't think there's a single line of dialogue till the end of the movie, pretty sure, but maybe like one or two, but like minimal if any. But he goes through this Stargate, and he ends up ultimately in this trippy hotel room, kind of like bedroom setting, with like a lit up floor, but it kind of looks like a human world or whatever. Like a human home, like super fancy. Like I said in the Wikipedia description, it calls it like neoclassical or whatever. And I wanted to know, and then he sees himself in like different stages of life, but also becomes those different, like he sees an older version of himself, and then it cuts perspective and he is that version of himself. And we'll just kind of watch him age really quickly through a handful of little vignettes before seemingly dying in bed with the monolith there, and then being reborn as the space fetus. And I wanted to know if any of that came from the book or short story, as far as you were aware.
This is not from anything that I read. It was very interesting. I have so many more thoughts on it in the next segment.
Okay, yes. That is, we're going to get into that. So our next segment is Lost in Adaptation. I didn't really have a Lost in Adaptation questions, but what I did have was, we're just going to discuss what we think this all means. We're going to get into some other people's interpretations of the film, what Katie got out of the story. We're just going to kind of break down thematically what we think is going on here. My last note before we get to that, though, was that, and this is for St. Louis heads, and maybe other places had this, I don't know, but the sequence in this film where Dave goes through the Stargate is almost identical to the opening sequence when you would go to the St. Louis Science Center when I was a kid. I don't know if they still play this part. I haven't been to the OmniMax. St. Louis Science Center in St. Louis has this thing called the OmniMax, which is similar to an IMAX theater, except the screen is wraps around like all the way around you, basically. They play IMAX movies there now, but initially it was called OmniMax. And it's even bigger than an IMAX screen, and it wraps around the seats, basically, so it almost encapsulates your entire field of view when you're sitting in the seats. which allows them to do really cool stuff because movement, when you're moving, it feels like you're moving. Like when the camera is moving from a first person perspective view, because it's literally filling all your vision. It's like being in a giant virtual reality like headset kind of, where it feels like you're moving. And they would always start every movie they usually played like nature documentaries and stuff. They would do like, you would go like under the ocean, or they all kinds of different stuff. But before every one of those, they would play this opening thing that like introduced the OmniMax, and it was started with this traveling through a space tunnel thing that is almost identical to this sequence and very clearly inspired by this sequence. They very clearly were like, let's do that. I always thought it was super cool. It was always my favorite part as a kid because it was just, you felt like you were flying through a wormhole in space, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. Anyways, anybody else ever?
I've actually never been in the OmniMax at the Science Center.
Really?
We went there a lot, but we never did the stuff that cost extra money.
Yeah.
The Science Center's free. Yes. But
that was the only thing we ever did, was the OmniMax, just because my dad loved it a lot, and we didn't do it every time, but whenever there was something specific, because they would rotate shows pretty often, and whenever there was something really specific that we wanted to go see, I remember seeing like a Blue Angels like in the cockpit, like you know, flying around thing. My friend actually threw up after he had to leave in the middle. He got motion sick from it and had to leave, and he threw up on the stairs walking out of the OmniMax. I remember that, but yeah, loved the OmniMax. I don't know. I assume other cities had similar things.
I would think so.
St. Louis wasn't the only place that had this, but super cool. And yeah, it's if you want to know what it's like to do the Stargate sequence, just go back in time to St. Louis Science Center in the mid '90s and go do their opening sequence of their OmniMax. All right. It's time to get into it. We're gonna break down what we think this whole thing is about in Lost in Adaptation.
Just show me the way to get out of here, and I'll be on my way.
Where is it lost?
Yes, and I want to get unlost as soon as possible.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this, I guess. What do we think this whole thing means? Specifically, the whole sequence at the end. This is obviously the part that is the most quote-unquote confusing. It gives you kind of the least... It's the most narratively nebulous sort of part of the film. And I kind of wanted to discuss what we got out of it and what we think the ultimate message is. And I also want to compare that to the short story. So I guess first, what is kind of the ultimate message that you got out of The Sentinel, the story, as opposed to, and we'll talk about the film after that.
So the short story, I think, is more or less like a creepy little reminder that we're probably not alone in the universe.
Okay. I would say the movie's not that.
The movie is not that. Yes. So like they find this pyramid on the moon. They can't figure out what it does. And the narrator muses that them finding this has probably indicated to whoever left it that Earth has advanced to a sufficient point for otherworldly visitors. And it has a banger last line. The short story ends with, "I do not think that we will have to wait for long."
Ooh, yeah, that's a good little spine tingling like last line.
But overall, I'm not sure that it has like a broader philosophical message akin to what the movie is maybe attempting.
Yeah. So we're going to get into some interpretations in a minute, and I touched on this already, but I just kind of want to, here seems as good a point as any to kind of put I'm sure people are interested in what I think of this movie. Just kind of broadly. It's an interesting movie, and I'm glad it exists. Obviously, like I said, it inspired so much of science fiction that without it, or science fiction film for sure, and TV, that without it, I can't imagine the world, the media landscape we would live in without this film existing. We have some other notes about it too. It holds up visually great. It's a stunning film to look at, and it does some really cool stuff in editing and in sort of montage and all that sort of stuff that I think is really interesting and really clever. And again, I'm glad it exists, but it also to me is definitely, at least for me, like a much less interesting film than, let's say, a similarly paced kind of style of sci-fi film, and that is Solaris, which we also did on this show. In my opinion, I find something like Solaris infinitely more interesting than I found this movie. I don't want to say infinitely, but like significantly more interesting than I found this movie because it felt more about people.
Yeah.
and more so about like relationships and stuff, and whereas this movie was more so about something I like, and that's part of it. And we talked about in the prequel, a lot of the the critics at the time had a lot of mixed feelings on this.
Yes.
And even some of them that revised their negative reviews initially still didn't necessarily land on like positive reviews. They just think I think it's probably in line of what I'm saying. It was like, yeah, it's impressive, it's a good movie, but it's also like kind of boring and pretentious in a way that's not as interesting as other movies that are also boring and pretentious. Because like I would argue that for a lot of people, Solaris would be very boring and pretentious, but I find that movie again just way more interesting. And maybe it's helped by the fact that I read the book, and so I don't know if I was watching them in isolation. But also comparing it to just a different like Stanley Kubrick film, something like The Shining has a lot more to say, at least to me, than this movie did. And again, this is all just your mileage may vary. Maybe you have a profound sort of religious experience watching this movie, or spiritual, whatever experience watching this movie. But it just felt like it didn't have a lot to say while having a lot to say, I guess. I don't know.
I agree. To me, this movie feels like someone challenged Kubrick to make the most pretentious film in the history of film, and he said, haha, bet.
Yeah.
And then when people were like, we don't get it, his response was, well, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I can see why in 1968 you might have been mad leaving the movie theater.
I can definitely understand the polarizing.
Yes.
I totally understand the polarizing reactions, because it is both simultaneously this visually stunning feast with really interesting, compelling, even when it is boring, a lot of times, not all the time, and I have notes about this, but a lot of times, even when it is boring, quote unquote, it is still really gripping and interesting. But not all the time. And I think the biggest thing is it just doesn't feel like it has and we talked about in the prequel about how Clark and him were like, well, if we didn't raise more questions than we answered, we didn't do our job. And that's fair. Like, I don't need the movie to answer the questions. I just even was having trouble figuring out what questions it was raising. I guess that's...
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head.
You know what I mean?
We want people to ask questions, but nobody knows what questions to ask, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and it's not nobody, and it's definitely like I said, I can feel the angry, maybe not angry, but the furious typing and responses and stuff. And it's not that there's nothing here to dig into. Obviously, again, as I said in the prequel, there's whole courses and theses and everything written about this film and the interpretations of it. And there are elements of it that I find really interesting. And I think the things that are most interesting to me, that one review that we read, I actually thought really summed it up well, was something about along the lines of the movie is at its peak when it's discussing monkeys and machines. Mm-hmm. Speaking of the apes in the beginning and Hal later, and at its weakest when it's talking about when it's at its weakest when it's about humans, which I also kind of agree with, because I do think there's really compelling parts of the film, but that some of I think it's just the ending just doesn't do a lot for me, because I it's not that I want there to be an answer so much as I felt like the questions it was provoking weren't even that interesting to me.
Yeah. I really struggled with the last 25 minutes of the film. The whole like after Hal dies and then everything there to the end. I was like, I don't even know where to even begin parsing this.
Yeah, and even within that, I think there's some interesting stuff. And we'll have some notes about it, but I really like the way, I think it's really compelling the way that he edited the Dave seeing himself and then the perspective switching and becoming him future self. That's all really clever and well done and interesting and a very effectively and silently kind of shows you what's going on, and that he is traversing through this. It's a very complicated idea that is being expressed visually in a very succinct way that I think works really well. But I still don't know what I'm supposed to be getting from that necessarily. So anyways, I want to get into some common interpretations of the ending and kind of talk about them. Like I said, honestly, part of the reason I'm going to outside interpretations was just a thing I don't normally do. We kind of just limit it to like what we get out of it. But again, the ending didn't do a lot for me personally. I didn't find it. I didn't have a particularly moving or impactful emotional reaction to the film in a way that I do with a lot of other sort of like headier movies that we watch. So I kind of did want to go to some outside things just to touch on it and discuss it and see what we thought. So Kubrick has always encouraged people to interpret the movie however they want, obviously, but he did apparently offer up in a 1980 interview his kind of interpretation of the ending, which I thought was interesting, which I didn't realize he had done. And he said, quote, "I've tried to avoid doing this ever since the picture came out. When you just say the ideas, they sound foolish, whereas if they're dramatized, one feels it, but I'll try. The idea was supposed to be that he is taken in by godlike entities, creatures of pure energy and intelligence with no shape or form. They put him in what I suppose you could describe as a human zoo to study him, and his whole life passes from that point on in that room, and he has no sense of time. It just seems to happen as it does in the film. They choose this room, which is a very inaccurate replica of French architecture, deliberately so inaccurate, because once one was suggesting that they had some idea of something that he might think was pretty but wasn't quite sure. Just as we're not quite sure what to do in zoos with animals to try to give them what we think is their natural environment. This does mirror a comment that I had, which we'll talk about, that I thought was really interesting. How in the beginning of this movie, I thought the scenes in the Africa section, the scenes where we're seeing the animals, you can very clearly tell they're on like little sets with like painted backdrop walls. And it reminded me of going to the zoo and going, especially the indoor exhibits at the zoo.
Yeah.
Where they have little like enclosures and then the wall is painted to look like the Serengeti or whatever to kind of create this illusion of space or whatever. And I thought it was very funny that he then references that kind of exactly in his explanation of the final thing. So we actually open with the kind of like zoo-like thing and then end with it, which was interesting. Anyway, when they get finished with him, as happens in so many myths of all cultures in the world, he is transformed into some kind of super being and sent back to Earth, transformed and made into some sort of Superman. We have to only guess what happens when he goes back. It is the pattern of a great deal of mythology, and that is what we are trying to suggest." End quote. So, yeah, I think I got most of that. Definitely the like time passing, the life passing, and him being in some sort of weird alien thing. But again, I think the part that falls flattest to me is the part where he goes, "We have only to guess what happens when he goes back." I'm like, okay, but what is
why?
Yeah, and what are we supposed to get? I think the best summary is that I'm not even sure what questions I'm supposed to be asking about this, let alone what answers to get from it. I will say that his description here matches pretty solidly with the expanded description that is given in the novelization, from what I could find. The novel goes into a ton more detail that the movie doesn't about what Dave perceives when he ends up in this room, and his hypothesis about it, and he basically concludes the alien zoo thing. So it does seem like this was their interpretation the whole time, apparently, because it's in the book supposedly. He also expands on the monolith thing, which I thought was interesting. That apparently the first one in Africa was like a tool to help humanity evolve. The second one on the moon, as you kind of mentioned, the speculation in the short story is that it's a signal for aliens that basically when humans find it, they've advanced enough and achieved space travel for something to happen, whatever. We don't really know what that is. And then the third monolith on Jupiter is the Stargate, apparently, that allows humans to travel to other parts of the galaxy. Again, the movie doesn't really explain any of that, but apparently it is expanded on in the novelization. So getting into some more philosophical kind of interpretations, a thing that I thought was interesting, and I've read zero Nietzsche, so whatever. But Nietzsche's philosophical tract, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is about apparently the potential of mankind, is directly referred to in the film because they use Richard Strauss's musical piece of the same name, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And Nietzsche apparently wrote that man is a bridge in this Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He was writing about how man is the bridge between ape and the Übermensch. Again, I don't know enough. I know what Übermensch generally refers to, but I don't know enough about Nietzsche's writings to really do too much here.
Yeah, me either.
Yeah. Then in an interview in the New York Times, Kubrick gave credence to this interpretation of kind of seeing it through the lens of like Nietzsche and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He's saying, quote, Somebody said man is the missing link between primitive apes and civilized human beings. You might say that this is inherent in the story too. We are semi-civilized, capable of cooperation and affection, but needing some sort of transfiguration into a higher form of life. Man is really in a very unstable condition, end quote. Also, in the chapter from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, titled Of Three Metamorphoses, Nietzsche identifies the child as the last step before the Uberman, which apparently also comes after the camel and the lion. I don't know. I don't know. I've not read Nietzsche. Which also it kind of supports the interpretation because the star child at the end would coincide with the idea of like moving through the evolution before ascension, Ubermensch, whatever, being like a rebirth as a baby or whatever. So that does all kind of tie in. And then finally, another way that people kind of interpret it and the film is as an allegory for conception and just life in general. And I thought this one was interesting mainly because it's very clear visually, because this interpretation sees the Discovery 1 spaceship as a sperm, which it's this giant white long thing with a big bulbous head on it, and then Jupiter as the ovum, and that the meeting of these two as the rebirth of humanity in the Star Child. So, there's interesting stuff there, but again, it comes back to but what am I supposed to get from that? Like, what am I supposed to like take to heart from that? Like, okay, yeah, humanity needs to like, sure, like we're on this journey. Humanity's always evolving. Maybe before we reach our truly like most enlightened selves, we have to experience some sort of otherworldly, but some sort of like.
We have to like transcend our own humanity
perspective, basically, and then be reborn as this new race that can actually. And there was another part of the ending that I thought was interesting that was in the original version or an earlier version of the story, is that when the Star Child came back, it apparently blew up a bunch of satellites. Like it caused a bunch of satellites in orbit, which is actually what we see at the beginning. So when the bone flies through the air and then it cuts to that satellite, that's not actually one of the spaceships that like the people are on. Apparently that's a satellite that in an earlier version of the script at the end we would have found out had nukes on it. And when the Star Child comes back, it like blows up all the nukes and like gets rid of them basically.
Okay.
They ended up changing that for a couple different reasons. One of them was that Kubrick thought it was too similar to like Dr. Strangelove, which is all about nuclear war and blah blah blah. And so he didn't want it to be too similar to that. And there was some other reason. They also found out that at the time there was some sort of treaty that there couldn't be nukes in space. I don't know if that's still true, but there was some sort of something with the Cold War, blah blah blah, where they literally couldn't have nukes on satellites. So he was like, well, that wouldn't even be possible, or something like that. I'm sure I'm butchering stuff, but there's several reasons that they didn't do that ending, and instead we just see the Star Child at Earth, and then it kind of ends. But apparently, I think that actually is a slightly more interesting ending. To some extent, honestly, it gives it more of like an
overall point.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
I think I would have liked the ending of this movie more had it ended with him in the room and like aging, and we had not gotten the space fetus.
Interesting.
I didn't know the space fetus was coming. And like we're watching the movie and he dies in the bed, and then we pop back to Earth and we started to see the space fetus like burgeoning up onto the screen, and I just went, no. I was not prepared, y'all. I was not ready.
I was like, oh, you didn't know about the space fetus? And you're like, I did not.
I know. And here's the thing, and maybe the problem is that I am watching this movie for the first time in 2023. I couldn't take the space fetus seriously.
It's definitely...
if he wants me to get a serious meaning out of it, I cannot. I'm sorry. I simply cannot.
It definitely is visually one of the things that has aged the worst.
Yeah, it's very goofy looking.
The least good, like of all the effects in this movie, like still hold up and look great almost entirely. Like this film again just mostly looks incredible. But that shot in particular, when you see it, it's like the most fake looking, I guess, for lack of a better term. But I don't hate it. I think, again, the original planned ending to me is a little more interesting because it at least feels like it has more of a point. And maybe he didn't want it, like, was another reason he didn't like it, is that it actually gave it more of like a concrete, like,
Yeah.
sort of through line. But yeah, it is interesting. And like I said, I think it's just, yeah, I think the biggest thing is it didn't raise, the questions it did raise weren't that interesting to me. It's like, I'm not mad at it for raising questions and not giving answers. I'm just not mad at it. I'm just disappointed that it didn't raise, to me, particularly interesting questions.
Yeah.
It's like, okay,
yeah. I mean, and I think that is a problem that I have with it too, is that it did raise questions, but those questions were not as interesting as I might have hoped.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm trying. I wish I had like re-listened to our Solaris episode, because that's, I think, again, just the closest sort of analogy we have in terms of as a film goes. Because that one, I loved that movie and the book, and I think the thing that I thought was really interesting is that the questions you're left with tons of questions when you get done watching that movie, but the questions in that were like, okay, did it matter that this person that came back wasn't the person that he thought? Again, I'm trying to remember. It's been so long since we talked about it. I don't remember all the details, but it was stuff because, like, you know, does it matter if this person that shows up, his dead loved one that shows up, isn't actually the person? He's also dealing with, like, the guilt of their relationship and the fallout and what happened, and like kind of raising questions about what happened there. How responsible is he for that? And again, I don't remember all the details of it, but it raised a bunch of questions that I liked thinking about when the movie ended. This one, I'm like, okay, what questions am I pondering when this movie ends? Okay, so other than like, what the fuck happened? I think that's what it boils down to. It's like, sure, I'm pondering, like, what did that mean?
Right.
But then when I get beyond that and I go, okay, so then even if I didn't find out like what it meant, I'm like, okay, so he's in this weird room and he sees himself aging. Okay, so this is about like life and death and the way maybe that our life like kind of passes by without us even noticing, but that doesn't really thematically tie into anything else in the movie, really. Most of the movie seems to be about like evolution and technology and kind of like the dangers of technology. Obviously, we have the weapon at the beginning with the tribe, and them using the weapon to kill the other tribe, and then moving into space, and then we see the dangers of Hal and how kind of we don't really understand exactly how Hal works, and then it kind of goes rogue and tries and kills a bunch of people, and kind of the morality of like, is it a sentient thing? Should we respect it as a sentient thing? Is shutting it down totally fine? There's interesting questions there, but then we get to the final one, and again, I think maybe that's what the original ending is more interesting to me, is that thematically ties into the rest of it. If the Star Child or whatever comes back and like vaporizes the nukes that are around, because it knows in order for humanity to achieve its next level of evolution, it needs to fucking be done with all of this death making stuff. Whereas up until this point, it's been about, because it's all been about evolution and about how humanity evolves and what allows us to evolve and how we get in our own ways and stuff like that. And then the ending, as it is in the film, I don't feel like it says anything or even asks any interesting questions about that. He just ends up in a space zoo and then becomes back as a space fetus. And I don't know what.
Yeah.
Okay,
no, I agree. I think if they had gone with that original ending, it would have tied together thematically a lot better.
Yeah.
Because, and I mentioned it, I think, in my final verdict, but one of my major issues with this film was that it felt very disjointed to me.
Yes. Yeah. And I actually think they did a pretty good job tying it all together, because I actually was impressed by how, like, it would feel disjointed, and then it would tie back in a way like, oh, so Dr. Haywood, because when we jump from the monolith on the moon to the Jupiter mission, you're like, what do these have to do with each other? Seems completely unrelated, and for the whole time it is unrelated. And then at the end, when he gets rid of Hal, you're like, oh, they're on the mission to figure out and investigate what the heck that whole encounter on the moon was. That's interesting. And so it always finds way. And then again, like when we jump from Africa to the moon, it's the same thing. We're like, well, what is this? Why do we hold the thing in Africa? It doesn't seem relevant to anything we're doing now. But then when they find the obelisk on the monolith on the moon, you're like, oh, okay. So we're like, that all works. But then we get to the end and it just doesn't feel like that ties back in.
Yeah.
With everything else. Anyways. All right. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about this, especially in your final verdict and stuff. But that's the end of our Lost in Adaptation segment. Really interested to hear what other people have to say about this when we get to our next prequel episode in the feedback. But for now, we're going to see what Katie thought was better in the book.
You like to read?
Oh, yes. I love to read.
What do you like to read?
Everything.
Okay, so we know that the pyramid from the short story becomes the black monolith. And the pyramid is on the moon to prove that humans can go to the moon.
Yeah, basically.
So I was intrigued initially at the beginning of this movie to see what the implications of putting a monolith on Earth was. And I was mildly disappointed that the movie didn't really come back around to that. And I get it. Like, I get that the movie is implying that like it helped them evolve and discover tools and whatever. But it also felt a little bit like they put it out there and then just let it kind of dangle.
I will say that it is. We don't. And I don't know if we need to, but it is. You do wonder. You are left wondering, like, okay, so is it still there? Did we?
Yeah, like, is it still there, or did
like,
it leave, or did it just like get lost to time?
Yeah, did it get like buried, or what?
Happened?
Yeah, what happened to it? Yeah, that is an interesting. Yeah.
You mentioned the choral music, aka the wailing.
Yes.
Which is used initially in the Dawn of Man sequence, but then later on,
whenever the monolith shows up, basically, yeah.
And I found that music so upsetting.
Yes.
And again, I get it. I know it's supposed to be upsetting, but that doesn't mean that I have to like it.
Oh.
So
no, I think it's very effective. It creeped me out as a kid. And
it's effective, but I prefer the lack of it in the book because I didn't like it.
My only problem with it in the movie, my only note, and I'm qualified to give notes to Stanley Kubrick, would be my only note would be that it goes a little too long in a few of the scenes. I like what it does, and it makes you uncomfortable. I don't want to say I liked being uncomfortable. I did for a while, and then it's like, okay, and maybe that's even the point, but I don't think it is. I don't think the fact that it goes on long enough that you're like, okay, I get it.
Yeah, like
that's not the point.
It goes on long enough to where it stops being upsetting and starts being just annoying.
Yes, and I think that's the thing where it's like, if I would just trim it a little bit. Like I don't know how long it goes on in that opening scene, but it feels like 5 minutes. I would maybe like 3.5 minutes would have been enough. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just like just bring it back a little bit because it does eventually just get kind of annoying, and I don't think it's supposed to be annoying. It's supposed to be upsetting, and like you said, that is a very distinct difference, and it did eventually just become annoying, which is different.
I mentioned that I did like how the movie depicted the mystery of like, oh, what's going on the moon? Why haven't we heard from the moon base? But I wish we could have gotten the scene where the monolith / pyramid is discovered. Rather than just like jumping to, oh, they already found it. And now this is like a weird random little thing, but in the short story, we have a narrator, and when he spies this like thing glittering in the distance on the moon's surface, doesn't know what it is, he is at that moment in their like moon base, and he's frying sausages for them to eat. And I was like, I read that and I was like, I really hope that somebody fries sausages on the moon in this movie, just as like a random nod, because you would only get that if you had read the short story.
Yes. Yeah.
And I was like, that would be so fun. Yeah. So now I'm sad that nobody fried sausages on the moon.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things where, because Kubrick was so adamantly leaning into like realism, that he was like, all right, everybody eats like paste.
Yes.
Which I did think that was fun. I like we see several different meals, and one of them is they're drinking them out of straws when he's on the 0G ship, and then when they're in the ring of the ship when they're traveling to Jupiter, they have the little trays of like
Different colored
pastes,
baby food
that they eat. And I thought it was very interesting. I thought it worked. I thought it looked cool. And yeah,
no, it did.
It could be a fun little.
Sure.
The version in the movie definitely provides more like. It's a world building details that make it feel very like quote unquote real, whereas if somebody was cooking sausages it might not, but I get it. Who doesn't love a fried sausage? All right, let's find out what Katie thought was better in the movie.
My life has taught me one lesson, Hugo, and not the one I thought it would. Happy endings only happen in the movies.
We covered a lot of my things that I had in this section, but I still have a few notes. I really liked the sequence with these space satellites set to Blue Danube Waltz, even though I do think it went on a touch too long.
It's true of like every sequence in this movie, to be fair. It's like, okay, it went on just a touch too long.
Yeah.
Almost every sequence.
I loved the retro futurism look of the space station and like the spaceships and everything. The red chairs in the space station, in particular, were chef's kiss.
Yes, yeah, the retrofuturism in this movie is awesome. The aesthetic of the film is super cool. All of the sets are gorgeous. It's all just super neat. It's super cool. A lot of it feels pretty like real. Obviously, that's not what the world looked like in 2001, but it definitely has the feel of some of the stuff, we see. There's a little detail that I had that I thought was interesting is when they're watching the news report in the spaceship on the way to Jupiter, the screens they're watching on are vertically formatted. I don't know if they're watching on tablets that are like look like iPads basically, which I thought was interesting. And sometimes that's chicken and egg stuff where it may be less of him predicting the future and more so engineers at Apple be like loving 2001. You never know with that kind of thing how much they were predicting the future versus people in the future were emulating stuff from the past. But anyways, yeah, and just in general, everything in this movie, again, all of the set design and the idea of space, the retrofuturism is just super cool.
I also really liked that this movie imagined future space travel as being like airline travel was during the mid-century. Yeah. Like with the stewardesses and everything.
Oh yeah, yeah. It is absolutely. It just looks like a Delta commercial. Yeah. Like a Delta magazine
but in
spread.
Space.
But in space. Which is, yeah, it is fun.
I also really liked that the movie didn't just like hand wave a total artificial gravity device when you're in like the spaceships, and chose to depict like a low or like zero gravity instead. Now, obviously, there's some artificial gravity in like the larger structures.
I don't think there is.
But
well,
when
sorry,
they're
other
like,
than
when
the
they're
spinning
on
thing, if
the
that's
spinning
what you
thing,
mean.
but what about when they're on the like space station before he goes to the moon?
I think that's also spinning.
Is it also
we
spinning?
See it. Remember, because that shuttle is landing and the outside, the whole thing is spinning. Yeah, it's also spinning. That is artificial gravity, to be fair, but it's not like magic artificial gravity. It's
no, I'm saying like
gravity.
I like that it didn't just go with like we're just
right. Yes,
there's an artificial gravity device on everything.
Yes, yeah,
and everybody just walks normal everywhere.
There is no hand wavy artificial gravity.
But I thought it was really interesting to see, particularly like when they're on the spaceships and like the way everybody like walks and moves.
And you see like the stewardess you're talking about, they have like you see her shoes say like grip. They're like Velcro shoes or something like that, and she like sticks to the floor or whatever. Yeah, it is cool.
Also, I have a question for you.
Yeah,
because I understood how they did a lot of the like low gravity shots and stuff where they're like turning the camera different ways. But there was one scene in particular where the stewardess, there's like a circular opening and you see her walk up the side of it.
Yeah.
And like go through a door. How'd they do that?
The whole set rotates.
So
basically the same way they did in Inception, the hallway fight scene where they're like running up the walls. And so that scene that's at the beginning when they're on the shuttle or whatever. And you're looking down a big like tube, basically. It's like the fuselage of like an airplane or whatever. It's kind of what it looks like. And she's at the end of it, and you can actually see the camera start moving, or you can see the motor start moving, because as soon as she starts walking up the wall, it shakes a little bit, and it's what that is the motor for the set she's in, or however they turned it like starting to turn, and it shakes a little bit at the beginning when it starts moving, but then after that it smooths out and it rotates. And so it's literally just the camera is attached to the set. So it's looking like the ground is here and she's walking, and I'm illustrating to Katie here. The ground is here, and then the camera is attached in the same perspective or the same orientation as the room is, and then the whole thing rotates. And so she's able to walk. She's just always walking on the ground, basically. But what is the ground is rotating, and the camera's rotating with it. So you don't even notice that it's rotating, basically.
So it ends up looking like she's walking up the wall and onto the ceiling.
Yeah, which they also did, like Fred Astaire famously did like a dance scene in a room that did the same thing, where the camera's attached to like the room as it's rotating, and he's like dancing up the walls and onto the ceiling and stuff. It's just the room rotates. They do it several times in this movie, and that one is actually the less impressive one to me. There's one later where Dave and Frank are getting into some part of their spaceship, and it took me a minute to figure out what was happening, because it's rotating in two pieces, kind of. And I was like, how did they do that? Because we see them do the same thing where they like climb up the wall into a different thing. I was like, but it's slightly different. And I figured it out, and they're just rotating the camera, and their part's not moving. Anyways. Point being, it's just a big rotating room, essentially.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That's how they did that. Without getting into more specifics. That's it.
I liked the virtual chess game where Hal wins.
Yeah.
The classic trope.
Yep.
And I really liked that the hibernation pods just straight up look like sarcophagi.
Yes.
Gotta love a little bit of creepy foreshadowing.
No, absolutely. Yeah, they're like, oh,
you're in your tomb, sir.
Absolutely make them look like sarcophagi. Yeah. Oh no, they're dead. No way. I don't buy it. All right, let's go ahead and talk about what the movie nailed.
As I expected, practically perfect in every way.
This is going to be a very short section, because really the only thing that the movie nails is the basic concept of finding some kind of alien technology on the moon's surface.
There you go. That's it.
That's it.
World's shortest movie nailed it segment in our history, I think. All right, let's go ahead and get to a few odds and ends before we get to the final verdict. We kind of mentioned it, but this is really one of those movies where it has been parodied and homaged into oblivion to the point that watching the original is sort of a surreal experience now. Like it's hard to do. It's hard to watch. It's something like The Matrix or Star Wars. Star Wars is a little different, mainly because I saw it at the time. Watching it for the first time, quote unquote, basically, now is a weird experience. Because again, it has been homaged and parodied, and like especially the song, which I think that might be the what is the one that plays during the Dawn of Man sequence.
I thought it was just called. I thought it was the same title as the movie. Is it not?
What is it called? 2001: A Space Odyssey? No. The song during the Dawn of Man sequence.
Yeah, like the main theme, right?
That's a classical piece.
Oh, is it?
I'm fairly certain. I don't think.
I literally only know that as the main theme of this movie.
I could be wrong, but
in fact, I think it was like the only solid thing that I knew about this movie going in was that music was in it.
Oh, maybe it is just 2001: A Space Odyssey theme. I thought that one was I guess maybe you're right. I thought that was a different classical piece.
It could be based on something, I guess. But that's literally all I've ever known it as, is the 2001: A Space Odyssey theme.
Okay, my bad. Never mind. There are a bunch of other scores that are, or songs that are just classical pieces, obviously. I guess I thought for some reason I thought that was, but anyways. But like that music is so... It's been used in so many things for so many, especially for spoofs and parodies, to the point where it's just like you hear it now and it's hard not to like not roll your eyes at it and just be like, oh, okay. But it is tough. It is one of those things where it is interesting to watch now
One thing that I loved in the opening Dawn of Man sequence was the completely unbothered tapers.
Yeah.
Just in there with the guys in
Moseying
the ape
around.
suits. Just not a care in the world.
Not at all. They're just hanging out. Hanging out. During that sequence, one of the things that was wild to me is there's the moment where there's literally just a dude in a monkey suit that gets attacked by a leopard.
Yes.
And I was like, oh my God.
And honestly, I'm gonna take issue here because that ape is a lot bigger than the leopard. And I feel like in reality it could have held its own a lot better than that.
Yeah.
The leopard just kind of kills it almost immediately.
Yes.
But like
You think it would be able to at least a little bit.
Yeah.
Fight
Because
back.
like gorillas and chimpanzees and stuff can like
They could mess up.
they could mess up a leopard.
Yeah. Unless they get completely blindsided, which this one did. It got leapt on. I guess it's possible, but yeah, you would think it would be able to put up a little bit of a fight, and
Yeah.
it does not. Also, it's probably because for the purpose of what they were filming, it's a trained leopard jumping on its trainer or whatever, and he can't like try to throw it across the room or whatever, or break its jaw or whatever an actual chimp would do in that setting. So, yeah.
I also want to give a shout out to the leg strength of the mimes in that sequence. So much squatting and jumping.
Yeah. Oh, they're just constantly squatting the whole time. It was very impressive. Yeah. There is one shot in this opening. I mean, the whole film is just gorgeous, but in particular, the shot where you're looking up once the monolith shows up, and I think you posted it today, maybe on social media. Or one of them. There's several of them, but the main one in this opening sequence is where it's a shot up the monolith at the sky, and you see the like it's like an eclipse or something. It's like or maybe not an eclipse, but you see like the moon and the sun or whatever, and it's just so freaking cool. I love that shot so much. And I was also really impressed. Speaking of the mimes, in general, I thought they were pretty convincing, but there's one moment in particular. And that is after the monolith shows up, where the first ape thing that figures out tools / weapons is playing with that bone. The way that single actor is doing that was so convincing to me that I literally forgot it was a person in a suit and not just like a chimp or something. Like the mannerisms of how it's playing with that bone and moving around felt so convincing to me. Like I literally forgot that it was that it was a person in there. I was like, oh, that's right, that's a person pretending to be an animal.
I mentioned the retrofuturism in this movie, and I want to just say something that I always find really interesting about like older media that's set in the future is how often it struggles to imagine how fashion specifically will progress. Because it's a little bit different than like depictions of anything else. It's just like a lot of struggle with imagining what are people gonna wear in the future. Yeah. Because everybody that we see just looks like they're in the late 60s.
Yeah. Yeah, with some slight tweaks to make it a little future. Yeah, it's the same. It's similar to the chairs and stuff. Like it's just that retrofuturism where everything looks like the 60s, but like, what if it was in the future? What if the 60s were in the future? Yeah. There's this, you talked about how some of this really does feel like a horror film. And there's this one moment that I was not prepared for and I thought was so cool. The whole lead up in this movie, everything is locked down on tripods, these big, grand cinematic shots of stuff. It's like either big wide shots or it's the cool shots of the camera rotating where, or these big like sweeping slow moves through space and stuff like that. It's all grand and these big grand tableaus and stuff like that. And then when we get to the moon, we get to the crater where the monolith is, and we get the shot it's a big wide shot of the crater, and you see the monolith in it, and you're like, oh, that's cool. And the music starts building up, and then they start walking down into the crater. And for the first time in the movie, and it's not the last time, they do it a few times, but for the first time in the movie, we cut to this like first person view handheld shot walking down into the crater with
Yeah.
the monolith like there, and it's so creepy and visceral and cool. It's like all of a sudden we have like a found footage like
like
horror film.
approaching this
Yeah.
terrifying thing.
Yeah, it like literally sent chills down my spine when it switched to that shot. I was like, oh my god, that's so cool. Again, it's so effective because nothing like it in the film has looked like that up until this moment. And then all of a sudden we get this, like we're there walking down into this thing. And this is like, oh my god, I loved it so much.
There's an intermission in this movie.
Yeah, it's like a second long.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about it when we
Yeah.
were watching it. It was enough time for them to pause the film.
Yeah,
however
in the
long
theater
it was.
they would actually probably just pause it.
But yeah, the little thing pops up, intermission,
yeah.
and I was like, bring that back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Immediately.
Yeah.
Listen, Hollywood, the people want intermissions.
Oh my god, yes. I don't know why. And you would think that theaters would want them.
Yes.
Because oh my god, you get a chance to go buy more stuff
Yes.
from it. Like I just don't understand. If
I
was a
just
movie-
and like in this era of every movie is close to 3 hours.
long. Yeah.
The people need intermissions.
Yeah.
I need to pee.
This movie wasn't even that long, and it had an intermission. I mean, it's a
know.
long, but it's like 2:20. Like it's not that long compared to some movies that we've covered, and especially like Endgame was like 4 hours long or whatever.
Just stick an intermission in
put an
there.
intermission
Put
in
an
there.
intermission in there. I will get up. I will go to the bathroom, and then I will say to myself, you know what? I could go for an icy.
Yeah, I could get some more popcorn. Yeah, I don't understand why we have gotten rid of them. There must be something where theaters can't just do it on their own. Like they can't.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah,
allowed
there's got to be
like,
something.
Because if I was a theater, I would just do it. I would just put a break in the middle of the movie. I would
And
find a
here's
spot in the
thing.
middle of the movie.
Here's the thing. It would only take one movie to do that.
Yeah.
And then all the rest of them would have to follow suit.
Yeah. I guess the only thing I can think is that you run the risk of I'm sure there's lots of people like us who'd be like, oh, thank God, let's get an intermission. There's not an insignificant number of people that be like, why is there an intermission in the middle of this movie? I got to sit here and wait. Oh, this sucks. I hate that. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely,
I guess.
that is at least some number of people, and maybe they just think it's not worth it. There's probably not that many people clamoring, knocking their doors down for them to add intermissions back. But if they were to do it, I wonder if they're worried about the.
I think we should all vote on it.
I agree. I think they would be surprised. I think most people would be like, absolutely. And I think it's a thing where it's like, if your movie is more than 2 hours long, or maybe like 2:30 or something, there could be some length where it's like, after this, put an intermission in. If your movie's 90 minutes, I don't need an intermission.
Yeah.
But if it's 3 hours long, I could use an intermission.
So another random thing that I really like in movies, I like when you can randomly tell that the miniatures are miniatures.
Yeah.
Because most of the time, it looks fine when they're using
Yeah, it
miniatures.
looks great, yeah.
Like 99% of the time. But then you get that like 1% where just out of nowhere, all of a sudden everything looks really cute.
Yes. Yeah, you're like, oh. Yeah.
Look at that teeny little spaceship.
Yeah, for sure. So we kind of touched on this, but I just want to expand on it a little bit more. And, one of the biggest complaints about this movie is that it is boring. And yeah, it is. It is pretty. It's cool. And it's not uninteresting. But I could even... I have a lot more patience for movies now than I used to. And especially certain types of movies. But this one really didn't grip me in the way that, just comparing it to a movie we watched very recently, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which is our bonus episode for April, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is also it's about the same length, like just over 2 hours. Also similarly kind of slowly paced.
Yeah.
Takes its time, deliberate, arguably boring to some people. But I was riveted to that whole movie the entire time. And this movie, I'm a space nerd. I am the target demographic for this movie. Like I like sci-fi a lot. I don't mind movies that are slower paced and quote unquote boring. And I love space. I love space exploration. Since I'm a little kid, I have always loved all that sort of stuff. I find it endlessly fascinating. But even during some of the sequences, in particular in the second half of the film when we're on the spaceship, the scene, and the one that stuck out to me in the first note where I had this, is the scene where he goes outside in the EVA pod to get the piece out of it to inspect it.
Oh my God, that took so long.
Goes on for so long.
So long.
And again, this is for me. And I'm like, okay, we could just a little bit of editing here. Just a little bit. Like, I get it. And just a little bit. We can pick up the pace a little bit. Ugh. Some other notes I had. I love all of the cockpit shots with the HUD lights on their faces. It's mainly Dave, but whenever Dave is sitting in like his EVA pod, the lights reflecting on his face, it all looks so cool.
Yeah, it makes really good use of, is it still diegetic if it's light?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, kind of. I don't know. There's probably, it's motivated lighting, I think is generally how we refer to it for lighting, but it's similar.
Like the lighting that's in the world of the story.
As opposed to
like the big lights that they use to light a set.
Yeah. It is definitely, it's interesting because this is in a period where cinematographers and directors and stuff were not worried about lights being motivated. Because that's the way it's always kind of discussed in modern terms when talking about lighting, which is a thing I watch a lot of stuff on because in my day job I do cinematography, and that is a big move in modern cinematography. Is we've moved much more, in my opinion, slightly to the detriment of some things, in the direction of all light needs to be motivated and real and in the world in some way, which is also one of the reasons this is a whole other thing, but all of the conversations that everybody always about, like, why is this so dark? Why is everything so dark? A big part of that isn't that people don't understand, or isn't that the cinematographers like don't know how to light things. It's way more complicated. It's actually that they know how to light things so well that it's like, it's basically cinematographers, modern cinematography, the style that is in fashion broadly, is all light that you see on screen needs to have a reason to be there, other than I want to light this thing up. It needs to be coming from something. It needs to have a reason to exist. It is frowned upon in many modern cinematography sort of oeuvres to just like have a light hitting somebody's face that is, where's that coming from? So like in the spaceship, in this example, in this film, with them being in that set, in like the EVA pod, if his face was like just being hit by some bright like blue light or something that looked cool, but like you don't know where it's coming from, that's a big no-no to a lot of modern cinematographers. Right. It is. So in this movie, and again, this movie is kind of ahead of its time in that regard, in the sense that most of the light that you see does feel very motivated, which creates very realistic and cool feeling things sometimes. In this instance, it's all the light panels from the thing is like shooting and hitting his face and stuff like that. But it also leads to, in certain situations, again, in nighttime settings, when you're out in the world in nighttime, cinematographers now try to make it look like you're actually out in the world in nighttime, and guess what? It's dark out. So it's dark, and that's what people are complaining about to some extent.
Yeah, you end up with your really hard to see like Game of Thrones scenes because the only light is coming from the dying campfire.
Yes, or literally the moon that is reflecting in a way. And back in the day, with the way they would light a moonlit night was they'd have a big blue light or whatever hitting you in the face, but that's not what moonlight actually looks like. And cameras are good enough now, and sensors and blah blah blah, that you can actually kind of do that. And if you're viewing those things in the right situations and on the right screens, set to the right settings, it looks gorgeous and it looks real. But if your TV is not tuned perfectly, if you're blah, 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 and even then, even beyond all that, it can just be stylistically, it can be a thing that people don't identify. It just doesn't, even though it is realistic, quote unquote, looking, it can be something that people just don't like get and just be like, it's just dark. I don't know. As a whole other diatribe that I already started on, apparently. So I didn't want to get into it too much, but I have so much to say about that because it's one of the most fascinating things to me. It's a constant discourse on Twitter of people being like, why are all movies look like mud and they're dark now? Do people not know how to? Why does everybody suck it? And it's like, it's not that they suck. It's that it's a different style, and it drives me insane. But that nobody understands, like, not nobody. I've seen plenty of good threads out there breaking it down, but it's the vast popular, like, broad kind of cultural consciousness is like, everything's just dark now. Why? And it's like, there's a reason. You might not like the reason, but there's a reason behind it. They're not just bad at their jobs, but anyways. I will say one of the other things about this movie that I really enjoyed is how horrifyingly clever it is in its simplicity. In particular, there was one sequence that sparked me to write this note, and that is the sequence where Hal kills the people in stasis. It literally, we just cut back and forth between like 3 shots. It's like maybe even 2 shots. It's the vitals. It's the screen with all their vital readouts or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think occasionally shots of the actual like sarcophagus, like stasis pods.
Yeah.
And then occasionally, eventually, Hal's little red light.
Yeah.
That's it. There's no dialogue. There's no nothing. And it's such minimal information, but the way that is all edited together is so, again, it's so simple, but conveys so much with such sparse imagery too. It's just like this is readout and then a little red light, and it's just so ominous and cool. It's just, again, little moments like that. The actual art of filmmaking in this film, incredible, fantastic, unparalleled. It's just the overall like thematic narrative and stuff isn't all that interesting to me. But anyways, another shot that I loved and thought was super cool is at the end when he does get to Jupiter. We see this awesome shot of, apparently we've reached like an alignment of all of the moons of Jupiter.
Yes, yeah.
And it's like we see Jupiter and then it's all the moons lined up, and then the monolith is just there in the middle. It's super cool. I love that shot. It's awesome. Although then another thing editing wise that it's so weird, it bounces back and forth. So much of this movie is edited so brilliantly, and then we get to that, and you talked about this, the montage of at the end when he goes through the portal.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like flying through the portal. It starts cool. We get all these cool lights and colors and blah, like he's going through a wormhole. And then he gets to some world, and we're like flying over. This looks like Earth landscapes. It's like Monument Valley or something like that. But it's all like color shifted.
Yeah.
To like these weird like negative, like
dual tone
like things.
Yeah.
That's just that he basically took all the highlights and made them like one color, and all the shadows and made them another color, and then they change colors a bunch, and it goes on forever.
Oh my god. Forever.
It goes on forever. It goes on forever. But then at the end of that sequence, there's a great moment that I love, which is when he's coming out of that, and right before we arrive in the bedroom set, we see a close-up of his eye, and it shifts through all those different colors. Every time he blinks, it shifts through that color, and then it eventually ends on like natural, color again. And I love that little moment, that transition back to like reality or whatever out of this wormhole. It's just, you could have just made the sequence before it like half the length it was.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Speaking of those like dual toned landscape images, though, I thought those aged pretty poorly.
You think?
Yeah. To me, those looked like
your
something.
note says some pretty solid age makeup.
No. The landscapes.
The landscapes. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, the dual tone landscape.
Yes.
That he goes over.
Sorry. Yeah.
Those to me, like more than maybe anything else in the movie, looked like something that was made in the 1960s.
Yes, absolutely. It just doesn't it's not nearly as trippy or cool as it the rest of the stuff happening in that sequence is. And then again, it lingers on that longer than anything else, which is really weird.
Which gave me a lot of time to contemplate how bad it looked.
Yeah, I agree. It was definitely one of those moments where it's like, okay, this is the least interesting part, and we're spending the most time on it. And
Yeah. But yeah, my next note, I thought the old age makeups on Dave were pretty solid.
Yeah, they're pretty good. All things considered, they're very subtle and worked pretty well.
Yeah, and like the first one in particular, that was where he's just like middle aged, where he's just like a little bit older.
Yeah,
was very subtle and good looking.
No, yeah, it was very good stuff. All right, before we get to the final verdict, we want to remind you can do us a giant favor by heading over to patreon.com/thisfilmislit. Support us there for a few bucks a month, get access to bonus content. Like I said, we did Portrait of a Lady on Fire for our last month. This month we're doing, what is it called? Drop Dead Gorgeous. So every month we do a different movie or something like that and talk about it that's not based on a book, and you can hear our thoughts on that. Just support us for $5 or more a month on Patreon, get access to that, and at $15 or more a month you get access to priority recommendations, where if you have something you'd really love for us to talk about on the main episodes, shoot us that recommendation and we will add it to the list as soon as we can. You can also do us a favor by heading over to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Goodreads. Just give us a follow, likes. I don't even know how that works anymore. They've changed the way like on Facebook in particular. There's like different like likes and follows.
Yeah, I know. You can
whatever.
like follow or you can like a page. I don't even really
whatever.
know.
Just do whatever you can to see stuff posts from us. In particular, the prequel, like the feedback question posts where you can vote about which one you preferred, and more importantly, you can write your feedback, and we will talk about it in the prequel episode. Definitely go do that for this one. And then also you can do us a favor by heading over to iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you're listening to us. If it's a platform that you can give us a rating and a review, those are always very helpful. Just drop us a 5-star rating and write us a little review, and we would appreciate that as well. Katie, it's time for the final verdict.
Now, are you ready for your sentence?
Sentence? But there must be a verdict first.
Sentence first, verdict afterward.
This is a tough one. I genuinely enjoyed reading the short story. It had evocative descriptions, it moved at a good pace, and the ending was just deliciously creepy enough. I would honestly love to see the source material adapted more closely. Comparing the two, the short story can't match the movie for cultural impact. Everybody and their mother knows at least some reference to 2001, and you can very clearly see the impact that it had on the sci-fi genre, especially in film, and on film in general.
Yeah, even broader than just sci-fi,
Here's where it gets tricky for me. Obviously, the movie is visually stunning, but there were long stretches of it where I felt less like I was watching a movie and more like I was watching Stanley Kubrick flex on his fellow filmmakers. Which is fine, but it did make for an overall somewhat boring experience. The only part of the movie where I felt truly engaged with it was the HAL 9000 sequence. The opening and closing sequences felt only tangentially connected to the meteor middle, and I was left unsure of what the overall message was. And quite frankly, I'm not entirely convinced that Kubrick didn't just make up a meaning later on when people wouldn't stop bugging him about it. So that's the rub. Do you award the movie for being a visual behemoth with near unimaginable cultural impact? Or do you reward the short story for being tighter and arguably better at actual storytelling? To be honest, I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it depends on what you're looking for. So feel free to disagree with me, and I'm sure many of you will, but I think I have to call this one a draw.
Interesting. No, I think that makes sense. Again, it's very much, obviously in this one, it's a very subjective experience of just, what did you enjoy more?
Mm-hmm.
And it is hard to, or not necessarily what did you enjoy more, but it is hard to measure what you enjoyed more against what the film is, which is, apart from its cultural impact, it is just a really impressive, even if it didn't go on to have this huge cultural impact in a vacuum, it's still a very impressive thing to watch.
Yeah.
Even if it is kind of boring and pretentious and what all the other things we've discussed, it is still fascinating. Like even out in a vacuum, if I didn't know anything else, I would still want to have seen this movie once. But then I'm good. I don't need I don't think I need to.
I did contemplate giving it to the short story just to make people mad.
Yeah.
Not really. I would not really do that.
No, I know.
But I do think it would have been funny.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Katie, what's next?
Up next, we are going back to the well of animated fantasy.
Really just hitting it hard.
I know. Well, we're hitting some things that I've been wanting to watch and read, and this book series in particular has been on my to-read list for a very long time. So we are going to be watching The Black Cauldron.
I'm excited for this because this is a movie I never saw, but I've heard a lot about.
I have seen it. And it's very interesting. It's definitely like it's not one that I have fond childhood memories of because I didn't see it until I was older.
Yeah.
But it's definitely you can tell it's from the Don Bluth era of Disney.
Yeah. Yes. Like I said, all I've ever heard about is creepy and weird, but I know nothing else about it. So I'm interested to see what its whole deal is, which I think should be fun. But we'll be doing that in 2 weeks' time, and in 1 week's time, we'll have all of your feedback on 2001: A Space Odyssey. Can't wait to hear what you all have to say, where you disagree with us, where you agree. I would not be surprised if we have more agreement than we're expecting. I think.
Yeah.
Sometimes sometimes when we say what I think are controversial opinions about things, I expect more backlash than we get when people are like, actually, no, I think it's pretty boring too. Like a lot of times. And I don't know if that's just the fan base we've cultivated or what, but it is. I am interested to see what people think about this one and how, if we have any like super ardent defenders, like not even defenders, but like champions for the film who are like, no, this is the greatest. I don't know. I'm interested to see.
We'll
Can't
see.
wait. But we will see. We'll see about that in 1 week's time. Until that time, guys, gals, non-binary pals, and everybody else,
Keep reading books
keep watching movies
and keep being awesome.